In the history of world football, Roberto Baggio was not just a name but a symbol that transcended all limits of technique and emotion, a player whose every touch of the ball felt like witnessing living art on the grass, someone who scored more than 300 goals in his professional career, wore the Italian national team jersey as its creative soul, and especially his journey at the World Cup 1994, when he almost single-handedly carried the team into the final with decisive goals in the knockout rounds, those moments when the whole world held its breath with every stride he took. Not only that, he won the Ballon d'Or in 1993, the most noble title for a football player, along with the FIFA World Player of the Year 1993, affirming his position as the best player on the planet at that time. In club colors, he won the Serie A title with Juventus, captured the UEFA Cup, and left a deep mark at Fiorentina, AC Milan, Inter Milan, and Brescia, not just through titles, but through the way he played the game, a style that could not be copied, where every action carried individuality, creativity, and full emotion, making him one of the greatest number 10s of all time, a symbol honored not only in Italy but around the world, where the name Roberto Baggio is tied to the pure beauty of football, a kind of football not just to win, but to touch people's hearts. But behind all that glory was a truth that very few people ever saw, a second life that existed in silence for more than 20 years, where Roberto Baggio was not a legend, but a human being fighting day by day with his own body, ever since a serious knee injury when he was just 18 years old, something that never truly healed, forcing him to play in constant pain, going through many surgeries, injecting painkillers before every match, just to be able to step onto the field like a normal person, but no one knew that, because he never spoke about it. He chose silence, continued to play, continued to run, continued to contribute, even when every movement was a trade-off, even when his body gradually broke down, and the moment at the World Cup 1994 was not just a missed shot, but the endpoint of a journey where his body had been pushed to its final limit. Yet what made his story different was not the pain, but the way he accepted it, without complaining, without making excuses, just quietly continuing, living with two parallel lives, one life that the world honored, and one life that only he had to endure, where willpower was not expressed through words, but through the fact that he never stopped. Before we delve deeper into the untold story of Roberto Baggio, please hit like and leave a heart, a small gesture for the man who played in pain that the world never saw. And if you want to understand what really happened behind that halo, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to explore together the second life he silently carried for 20 years. After all the lights, the titles, and the moments that made the whole world stand up, Roberto Baggio's story did not begin with glory, but started from a very different place, a small village in Caldogno where life passed slowly, simply, and almost had no room for big dreams, in a large family with 8 siblings, where each child's voice seemed to dissolve into the busy rhythm of life and everyday worries, where no one really had time to listen to the small thoughts forming in a boy's soul. And right in that space, Roberto did not grow up as a noisy or standout child, but as a quiet child, always standing on the edge of every conversation, observing more than participating, feeling more than expressing, as if from very early on he already understood that the world was not always a place for those who wanted to be heard. In a crowded family, love still existed, but it was not always expressed through words or clear attention, and for Roberto, that gradually became an unnamed emptiness, a feeling of absence that he could not explain but always carried with him, not abandonment but a form of prolonged silence, where emotions were not spoken, where small sadnesses had no place to rest, and over time he learned to keep everything inside, without complaining, without demanding, just simply accepting. That very silence became part of who he was, not as a choice but as a survival instinct, a way to exist without needing to attract attention, a way not to be hurt more in a world he never felt he fully belonged to. And then, amid all those silences, football appeared, not as an opportunity but as a refuge, the only space where he did not need to say anything yet was still understood, where every touch of the ball was a time he could express things that words could not describe, where he was no longer the child standing outside but became the center of a very private world, where everything became clearer, easier to understand, and most importantly, where he felt he existed fully. On small roads, on uneven patches of land, he ran, he dribbled, he fell and stood up again, not to become a great player, but just to hold on to that rare feeling that he had a place to belong. And perhaps that was why football was never just a game for Roberto, it was language, It was liberation. It was the only way for him to face the world without having to say the things he had never learned to express. But at the same time, that childhood also quietly formed something else, a habit that would follow him throughout his life, the habit of enduring in silence, the habit of not sharing what he was going through, the habit of keeping both pain and joy like secrets that did not need to be explained. And when he grew up, when the world began to notice his talent, when eyes started turning toward him, no one realized that behind that calm was a person who had become used to not being heard, a person who had learned to live without needing to be understood. And that very thing, that silence formed from those early years, became the foundation for everything that would happen later, when life began to place on his shoulders greater, more painful, and much lonelier challenges than what a boy once standing quietly on the edge of a large family could imagine. Roberto Baggio's youthful years passed in familiar silence, where football gradually became the only thread connecting him to the world. But right at the moment when that dream began to become clearer, when he was no longer just a boy playing ball on small roads but had stepped onto the professional path with all his fragile hopes, a moment arrived, without noise, without warning, but enough to change the entire rest of his life. A seemingly normal play on the ball, a movement he had performed thousands of times before, and then his knee folded in a way it never should have. A sharp, cold pain spread throughout his body, making everything around him seem to slow down. No more cheers, no more calls, only a terrifying silence that he had been familiar with since childhood, but this time it was no longer the silence of emotion, but the silence of fear, the fear that the only thing that made him feel he existed might have disappeared forever. When he was carried off the field, when the eyes of those around him gradually became more serious, he began to understand that this was not a normal injury. Doctors spoke of a torn ligament, of damaged cartilage, terms that at that time in the 1980s were almost synonymous with a young player's career ending before it truly began. And for Roberto, that was not just losing a job but losing himself, because outside of football he had never known who he was. The surgery took place in a context where sports medicine still had many limitations. Without modern methods, without certain guarantees, only risks and fragile hopes. And when he lay in the hospital bed, with no grass field, no ball, only a painful body and long days passing slowly, for the first time in his life he had to face an emptiness that even silence could not cover, an emptiness where questions began to appear that he had no answers for. If he could no longer play ball, then what would be left? If he no longer had the feeling of belonging on the field, then where would he belong? The recovery days were not like what people usually imagine, with no inspiring moments or clear progress, but only repeated pains, exercises that stretched to exhaustion, the first steps where every movement felt like tearing his knee apart, and above all the loneliness, a loneliness deeper than anything he had ever experienced as a child, because this time it was not a lack of attention. There were nights he lay looking at the ceiling, not sleeping, not thinking in words, only feeling a silent fear spreading, that everything might have ended before it truly began, that the years chasing the ball, the dreams not yet named, all might stop right here in a quiet room with no audience, no lights, no one witnessing. But what made this period different was not just the pain or the loss, but the way Roberto faced it, without complaints, without anger, only the familiar silence. But this time that silence carried a different meaning. It was no longer a way to avoid being hurt, but became the only way to endure, to continue existing in a reality he could not change. And day by day, amid the pains and repeated exercises, something gradually formed, not complete recovery but acceptance, acceptance that this body would never return to what it was before, acceptance that if he wanted to return to the field he would have to carry this pain for the rest of his life. And right at that moment, when he decided not to give up, not because he was sure of success but simply because there was no other choice, Roberto Baggio's second life truly began, a life where football was no longer just joy but became a battle, where every run was a trade-off, where the dream was no longer something natural but something to be fought for day by day, bit by bit. And though he could not know it then, this injury did not just take away part of his body, it took away his innocence, took away the feeling of safety, and in its place was a person who would have to learn to live with pain as an inseparable part of himself for the next 20 years. After those long months that seemed to have no end in the hospital and recovery room, Roberto Baggio finally returned to the grass. But it was no longer the return of a whole person, but the return of a body that already carried invisible cracks within it. A body that time and medicine had left indelible marks on, where every run had to be paid for with pain, where every touch of the ball was no longer pure freedom but a calculation between ability and limitation. No one saw what had really happened inside his knee. No one felt the stiffness in every movement that he had to hide with technique and willpower, and when he stepped onto the field for the first time after the injury, the world saw a player returning, but no one knew that he was playing in a completely different state from anyone else on the field that day. Every acceleration was a time when his body reacted as if it wanted to stop. Every change of direction was a reminder that the limit had been crossed long ago, but he still continued, not because his body allowed it, but because football had become the only thing left that he could hold on to. In the first matches after returning, Roberto learned to live in the strange division between two worlds. One world that the audience saw, where he was a young talent coming back, and another world that only he knew, where every run was a negotiation with pain, where every collision could leave consequences that lasted for many days, but no one was allowed to know that, because in professional football, weakness had no place to exist. He began to hide his true condition instinctively, not through words but through silence and discipline, not complaining to the doctors more than necessary, not letting his teammates see the moments when he had to sit alone after training, when the pain spread to the point where standing up became a challenge. On the field, he was still Roberto Baggio, still those soft touches, still those artistic passes, but behind those moments was a body always in a state of alert, always having to predict every movement to avoid a mistake that could make everything collapse again. The scariest thing was not the return itself, but having to live with that return every day when there was no longer a healthy version to compare to, when everything had become a new standard, where pain was no longer a warning sign but had become part of the routine, part of existence. He did not talk about it, did not share it, because no one really wanted to hear a player say that he was playing in pain, and also because he himself understood that if he started to speak out, perhaps he would no longer have the strength to continue. That was why Roberto learned to split himself into two people, one who stepped onto the field under the lights, receiving the expectations and gazes of thousands of spectators, and another who remained in silence, enduring everything that no one saw, no one knew, no one named. Those two lives existed in parallel, becoming clearer with every match, every season, every time he had to get injections to be able to take the field, every time he returned to the locker room with a heavy body but still had to keep a calm face, as if everything was still normal. No one realized that his greatness lay not only in the goals or the technique, but also in the fact that he had learned to continue playing in a body that was no longer complete, learned to turn pain into part of professionalism, and most importantly, learned not to let the world see the human part that was gradually being worn down inside. And it was precisely in that silence that Roberto Baggio's second life truly began. A life where light and darkness were no longer separate but coexisted in every run, every breath, and every moment he touched the ball on the grass. After returning to the field in a body that was no longer intact, Roberto Baggio not only had to fight physical pain, but also had to enter another war that was more subtle, colder, and sometimes more ruthless than the injury itself. That was the war with tactical systems that he never truly belonged to. In the eyes of the football world, he was a genius, a player who could create moments out of nothing, a person whose feet carried imagination that no one could copy. But in the eyes of many coaches, he was a problem, an instability, something that did not completely fit with the tight tactical structures that were shaping modern football. And it was precisely in that gap, between the admiration of the fans and the skepticism of the system, that Roberto began to feel more clearly than ever that talent did not always mean belonging. He did not play the ball the way tactics required. He played the way emotion led, where every action was a choice more instinctive than programmed, where creativity sometimes broke all the rules that had been set, but in an environment that increasingly valued discipline and structure, that made him a difficult-to-control exception. There were matches where he was substituted early, not because he was not good enough, but because he did not fit the way the team wanted to operate. There were periods when he had to sit on the bench in silence, watching other players perform roles that he knew he could do in a different way, but no one asked him about that. And gradually, a painful truth formed in him, not that he lacked ability, but that the football world was gradually becoming too narrow for a talent like him. What made everything heavier was the way he was perceived from the outside. When he did not play according to the system, people said he lacked discipline. When he did not shine in a specific match, people said he was inconsistent. When he did not fit with a certain coach, people began to question his seriousness. No one saw the full picture. No one saw a body that had to endure prolonged pain from the old injury. No one saw a person who had to adjust every run so as not to hurt himself. And even less did anyone see that in every decision on the field, he always had to balance between the ability and the limits of a body that was no longer as before. In the big clubs where he once played, he was always welcomed as a star, but that welcome did not last long enough to become understanding. At Fiorentina, he was a symbol, but also the one who had to carry too great expectations. At Juventus, he was a star but had to share space with tighter tactical systems. At Milan or Inter, he always existed as a special piece, but never completely fit the overall picture. Wherever he was, he carried the same repeating feeling, the feeling of standing between recognition and strangeness, where he was seen but not truly understood. There were days when he stepped onto the field and clearly felt that he was playing in a world not made for him, not because he was not good enough, but because football was gradually becoming a system where pure creativity was limited by rigid principles. While he looked for spaces to create the extraordinary, the system demanded stability. While he lived by emotion, the system demanded repetition, and it was precisely that difference that kept him in a state of half-belonging, half-excluded, even when he was standing on the field with the best in the world. But the most painful thing was not the conflict with tactics, but the silent isolation it created. No one said outright that he did not fit, but he could feel it in every substitution decision, in every look from the coaching staff, in every time he had to start again from the bench instead of being given full trust. And in that silence, Roberto did not protest, did not argue, did not break the order. He just continued to play, continued to adapt, continued to exist in an environment where he increasingly felt he was an indefinable exception. It was precisely in this period that his second life became clearer than ever. Not only the life of a person living in physical pain, but also the life of a genius who always stood on the edge of belonging, where his talent was admired but not always accepted, where he always had to prove his value not just once but repeatedly, in silence, in loneliness, and in a world that was gradually forgetting that football was once an art before it became a system. While the football world became increasingly strict with tactical templates, Roberto Baggio entered a stage where his talent could not be denied, even though he had never truly belonged to any system, and it was precisely in that paradox that his career began to rise strongly, not through physical perfection, but through something deeper, a willpower that had been forged from the pain he had never spoken about. At Fiorentina, he was not just a player, but became a symbol, a person who brought hope to an entire city, where every time he touched the ball, the audience not only waited for goals, but waited for a beautiful moment, something that rose above mere results, and he responded to that with performances that made people forget the reality that behind that softness was a body always in a state of endurance. His goals were not simply technique but a combination of imagination and control, where he could create space in places that did not exist, where he turned difficult plays into something that seemed natural, and that was exactly what took him from a promising talent to one of the most talked-about players in Europe. But that rise did not happen under ideal conditions, but on the contrary, it was built on the foundation of the limits he was forced to accept every day. His body never truly recovered after the injury at 18 years old, and when the intensity of playing increased, when the pressure from big matches became harsher, the pains also became more pronounced, no longer fleeting sensations, but prolonged signs that followed every training session, every match, every season. To be able to continue playing at a high level, Roberto began to rely on painkillers as part of his routine, not because he wanted to, but because that was the only way for his body to meet the demands that professional football placed on it. Before every match, before every important training session, the injections became part of the ritual, something he did not talk about but was always present, like a reminder that the price of continuing was never small. When he moved to Juventus, the pressure no longer came only from the field but also from the expectations of one of the biggest clubs in Italy, where titles were not a goal but a requirement. And in that environment, Roberto not only had to prove that he could shine, but also had to prove that he could do it consistently, in a system he had never fully integrated into. And once again, he did it, not by changing who he was, but by finding a way to exist within the limits he could not break. He won the Scudetto, he shone in big matches, he scored important goals, and the world began to see him not only as an artist, but as one of the best players on the planet. In 1993, when he won the Ballon d'Or and was honored as the best player in the world, that was not only the peak of his career, but also a profound paradox, because while his fame reached its highest level, his body began to enter a stage of clear decline more than ever. The pains could no longer be completely hidden. The recovery days became longer. The matches where he had to struggle to finish became more frequent, and even though the world saw a star shining, Roberto clearly felt that the price he had to pay was increasing day by day. But what made this journey special was not the titles or the recognition, but the way he continued moving forward without letting anyone see the full truth. He did not talk about the nights when the pain kept him from sleeping, did not speak about the times he had to wonder how much longer he could continue, did not share the fear that one day his body would no longer respond and everything would stop abruptly. Instead, he stepped onto the field with the familiar calm, with a playing style so light it seemed like everything was still happening naturally, as if his body carried no burden at all. His fame continued to grow, his name was mentioned everywhere, his goals were replayed, his moments were honored, but parallel to all of that was a truth that only he knew, that every step forward in his career came with a small loss, a part of his body worn down, a part of his strength that would never return, and it was precisely in that contrast between glory and exhaustion that Roberto Baggio continued to build his legacy, not as someone gifted with talent, but as someone who had to fight to keep every part of it. And perhaps what the world never truly understood was that his rise was not a natural journey, but a series of painful choices, where every time he stepped onto the field was a time he accepted trading another part of himself in exchange for moments that others would only remember as beautiful goals, titles, and applause that never knew their real cost. When Roberto Baggio's name echoed across European stadiums, when tens of thousands stood up every time he touched the ball, when the cheers stretched on as if they would never end after every goal, the world believed they were witnessing one of the greatest players of their era, a genius who could turn fleeting moments into eternal memories, and indeed on the grass, he was all of that, the perfect curling shots, the touches so soft they seemed not to belong to reality, the passes that only he saw before they happened, all creating an image that fans not only loved but worshipped, as if every time he played was a time they witnessed something rare and unrepeatable. But while those cheers grew louder, while the applause became a familiar part of every match, there was another truth happening in parallel, silent and unseen by anyone, a truth that no spectator could feel from the high seats, that his body was gradually breaking apart with every match, every collision, every time he was forced to push beyond his own limits. After every match that people called brilliant, after every moment that the media praised as proof of genius, Roberto did not step into a world of rest and glory, but into a completely different reality, where the locker room became quieter, where he had to stay longer than the others, where sometimes just standing up from the chair became a challenge, where the pains were no longer hidden by the adrenaline of the match but became clear, heavy, and prolonged. There were nights he could not sleep, not because of excitement after victory, but because his body would not allow him to find comfort. There were mornings he woke up feeling as if he had never truly rested, as if the match had not ended inside his body. But no one saw that. No one turned the camera to those moments. No audience was there to witness it, and therefore it almost did not exist in the story the world told about him. What made this loneliness deeper was that it existed right in the middle of the admiration of millions of people. He was not abandoned, not forgotten. On the contrary, he was loved, praised, called by name with all respect, but that very thing created a distance he could not cross, because those who loved him only saw one part of him, the shining part, the winning part, the part that brought joy, and they did not know what price he had paid to achieve those moments. He could not tell them, could not stand in front of tens of thousands and explain that behind a beautiful goal were days of painful recovery, that behind a perfect touch was a body gradually depleting, because that did not belong on the field, did not belong to the game they came to enjoy. And so he continued to live in two parallel worlds, one world where he was honored as a symbol, and another world where he was just a human trying to keep his body from completely collapsing. The applause never stopped, the praises continued to be repeated, but inside, he began to feel clearly that he was walking on a road with no stopping point, where every step forward came with an irreversible wear. Perhaps the most painful thing was not the physical pains, but the feeling that no one really knew what he was going through, that everything the world saw was only the surface of a much more complex story, that even in the most beloved moments, he still had to keep most of himself in silence. And in that silence, between the cheers and the sleepless nights, Roberto Baggio continued to walk, not like a winner enjoying glory, but like a human gradually breaking apart while the whole world was still clapping. When he entered the summer of 1994 in the United States, where the 1994 FIFA World Cup took place under harsh sunlight and unprecedented pressure, Roberto Baggio was no longer just an outstanding Italian player, but had become the greatest hope, almost the absolute center of the national team, a person on whose shoulders the entire nation placed the belief that he could bring them to glory. And in the first matches, when the Italian team struggled to find stability, when everything seemed not to run smoothly, it was he who stepped up, not with words but with decisive moments, timely goals that no one else could create. In the knockout rounds, when every mistake had a price, he scored against Nigeria, pulling the team back from the brink of elimination, then continued to shine against Spain, Bulgaria, step by step, match by match, as if he was carrying the entire team's journey on his legs that were no longer intact. And the world began to see something beyond technique. They saw a human pulling an entire collective forward with pure willpower. But what the world did not see was the price he had to pay for every one of those moments. Throughout the tournament, Roberto's body was never truly in a ready state. The old injury kept recurring. The pains were no longer something that could be fully controlled. And when the tournament entered the decisive matches, his condition became more serious. But he still continued to take the field. Not because he was healthy, but because he knew that if he stopped, the dream of an entire nation might stop with him. There were times he could almost not move normally in training sessions. There were matches where every run was an effort to push beyond the final limit of his body. But he did not speak out, did not ask for rest, did not seek sympathy, because in that moment he was no longer an individual but the symbol of hope, and a symbol was not allowed to be weak. The pressure came not only from the field but from millions of people following his every move, from the expectant eyes, from the stories the media built around him as a hero who could not fail. And in that context, Roberto continued to exist in the two familiar worlds, one world where he scored, where he was praised as the savior, and another world where he had to try to keep his body from completely collapsing day by day. Each match that passed not only brought him closer to the final but also pushed his body closer to the limit it could endure. By the final at Pasadena, where the whole world watched, where the Italian team faced Brazil, Roberto stepped onto the field not as a player at the peak of his physical condition but as a human who had been worn down through every match, every minute played before, and even though he still tried to move, tried to participate in the match, it was clear his body no longer responded as before. Every run was heavy, every touch lacked some of the freedom that had once made his name, and when the match went to penalties, all the pressure, all the expectations, all that he had carried throughout the tournament came together in a single moment. When he stepped up to the penalty spot, it was not just a shot but the convergence of everything he had been through, from his silent childhood, the injury at 18 years old, the years of playing in pain, the matches in this tournament where he had pushed beyond his own limits, all concentrated in a few short seconds, and when the ball flew over the crossbar, the world immediately remembered that moment as a failure, an image they would never forget. But no one saw the full story behind it. No one saw that the shot was taken by an exhausted body, a human who had gone further than anyone could imagine just to be there. That moment did not just end a match, but seemed to take away everything he had built in the eyes of the public, turning him from a hero into someone who made a mistake in a brief second. And the most painful thing was not the missed shot but the way the world simplified his entire journey into a single moment. But for Roberto, that did not change the fact that he had brought the team to the final, that he had played in a condition many others could not even step onto the field for, that he had given everything he had, even when the price was his own body. And when everything ended, when the lights gradually dimmed, when the cheers turned into stories retold, Roberto Baggio did not just leave the field as a player who had just failed a shot, but as a human who had lost a part of himself in that journey, a part that could never be regained, because that World Cup was not just a tournament, but the greatest price he had ever had to pay for continuing to live with two parallel lives, one life that the world saw, and one life that only he had to bear. That moment did not last more than a few seconds, but became a deep cut that lasted throughout the rest of Roberto Baggio's life, when the final of the 1994 FIFA World Cup reached the penalty shootout, when everything had gone beyond tactics, beyond calculations, beyond even physical strength, leaving only human beings standing in front of the goal facing pressure that no one could share. And in that moment Roberto stepped up, not as a hero at the peak of his form but as a human who had reached the final limit of his body, his legs no longer light as before, his knee no longer responding as a natural part of his body, and every step toward the ball carried a heaviness that no one in the stands could see. But before he took the shot, no one in the stadium thought about the matches he had carried the team through, no one remembered the goals that had brought them here, no one imagined the pain he had carried throughout the tournament. All that existed in that moment was expectation. Expectation so simple it was cruel, that he had to score, that he had to fulfill the role of a hero, and in a world where everything was reduced to the final result, there was no room for circumstances, no room for the truth behind it. When he placed the ball down, when he stepped back a few steps, perhaps that was one of the rare moments when time seemed to slow down, not because of the drama, but because everything he had been through seemed to gather in his head, not as a clear stream of thoughts, but as a feeling, an invisible weight that only he could feel. And when he ran up, when his foot made contact with the ball, his body was no longer a perfect machine, but a collection of limits that had been pushed too far, and the ball flew up, over the crossbar, disappearing into the night sky like a period ending everything that had happened before. In an instant, every sound changed, no longer anticipation but stunned silence, then reactions that no one could control, sighs, head shakes, eyes that no longer believed what had just happened, and in just a few short seconds, Roberto Baggio was no longer the one who had brought the team to the final, no longer the best player in the world, but became the one who had missed the decisive penalty, a simple, easy-to-understand image that was easier to remember than all the complexity that had come before. The media immediately seized that moment, repeated it, analyzed it, turned it into a symbol of failure, and in the world of headlines and images there was no room for context, no room for what could not be seen, only a simple story told over and over, that he had failed in the most important moment, that he had not fulfilled the task, and from then on a 20-year-long story was reduced to a shot that lasted less than a second. But what no one really understood was that that moment was not just a technical mistake, but the convergence of everything he had carried throughout the journey, from a body that had been damaged, from matches that had drained almost all his strength, from the pressure of an entire nation, and when all those elements came together in a single movement, the result was no longer just a shot, but an inevitable collapse of a body that had gone too far. After that shot, he did not collapse, did not show emotion clearly, he just stood there, quietly, with his eyes looking forward, as if trying to understand what had just happened, but perhaps deep inside he already knew that this moment would not disappear, that it would follow him, not in his body but in the way the world perceived him, and that very silence, the silence he had carried from childhood, from the injury, from the years of playing in pain, once again became the only way for him to exist in a reality that no one could share with him. The most painful thing was not that he missed the shot, but that he had to stand alone in the moment when the whole world turned its back, not because they no longer loved him but because they could not see beyond a single mistake, and in the bright lights of the stadium, among tens of thousands of people, Roberto Baggio became the loneliest person, not because there was no one around him but because no one was truly there with him in that moment. And from that second on, his second life was no longer a hidden secret but became a burden clearer than ever, because now he not only had to live with physical pain, but also had to live with an image that the world had decided to attach firmly to him, an image that did not reflect the full truth but was strong enough to cover everything he had once been. After the moment the ball flew into the Pasadena sky and took with it the dream of an entire nation, Roberto Baggio did not just leave the field with the pain of a player who missed a shot, but stepped into a phase where every look was no longer admiration but became questions, judgments, and conclusions drawn too quickly, too easily, as if the entire previous journey had never existed. Media around the world immediately redefined him, no longer as the one who had carried the Italian team through each round with decisive goals, but as the one who had failed in the final moment. Headlines appeared with a familiar coldness, repeating the image of the shot over the bar as a symbol of error, and in the world of short, easy-to-understand stories there was no room for anything more complex, no room for an exhausted body, no room for a human who had reached the final limit just to stand there. The fans, those who had once stood up to applaud every time he touched the ball, those who had once called his name like a symbol, now also fell into disappointment, not because they no longer loved him, but because they could not separate their emotions from the final result, and in a moment when they needed an explanation, a reason, someone to place responsibility on, Roberto became the easiest choice, not because he deserved it, but because he was the one standing at the penalty spot, the one who took the final shot, and in the simple logic of football that was all that was needed to define a failure. But what made this story more painful was not the criticism but his own silence. Roberto did not appear before the media to explain his physical condition, did not talk about the injuries that had worn down his body throughout the tournament, did not mention that he had played in a state that many others could not even take the field for. He offered no excuses, did not try to shift responsibility, did not mention factors that if spoken could have changed the way the world viewed that moment. Instead, he chose the way most familiar to him, the way he had learned since he was a child, silence. That silence was not easy acceptance, but a heavy decision, because in not speaking the truth, he let his story be told by others, by the media, by the public, by those who only saw one part of the picture, and because of that the image of him in the eyes of the world began to shrink, no longer a complex journey with many layers but a single moment, repeated over and over, a moment he never had the chance to explain. Perhaps what made him choose silence was not only his personality, but also the way he viewed responsibility. In Roberto's world, there was no room for blaming others, no room for seeking reasons to lighten a mistake, even if that mistake had been created by factors beyond control, and because of that he carried everything on his own shoulders, without sharing, without complaining, without resisting. He accepted that in the eyes of the world it was his fault, that he was the one who had missed, that he was the one who had not fulfilled the task, and instead of trying to change that story, he let it exist as it was, as a part of who he was. But what no one really understood was the price of that silence. When a person keeps everything inside, when there is no place to release, no one to share with, those emotions do not disappear, they only change form, becoming heavier, deeper, and for Roberto, it was not just the sadness of a loss, but the feeling of being misunderstood, of being defined by a moment that did not reflect his whole person. And while the world continued to move on, continued to look for new stories, new heroes, he remained there, carrying that moment, not as a memory that could be forgotten, but as a part of himself he could not separate from. From the outside one could see a player continuing his career, continuing to play, continuing to exist in top-level football, but inside something had changed. Not his talent, not his willpower, but the way he understood the world, the way a single moment could erase everything that came before it. And it was in that awareness that Roberto Baggio stepped into the next stage of his life, not as someone freed from the past, but as a human carrying it with him, quietly, without explanation, without protection, only with absolute acceptance. After carrying all the responsibility for a moment the world would never forget, Roberto Baggio stepped into the following years of his career, not as someone who had been freed, but as a human gradually fading in the very world where he had once shone. Not because he lost his talent, but because the way the world began to look at him had changed, slowly but irreversibly. The seasons after the 1994 FIFA World Cup no longer carried the same stability, no longer the clear upward journey as before, but became a series of interrupted phases where he still played, still created moments of genius, but was no longer placed in the central position as before. The big clubs he had once worn the jersey for began to change, not only in tactics but also in the way they viewed the future. Younger, stronger players appeared, more suited to the modern system, and gradually Roberto was no longer the default choice, no longer the first name mentioned when the team was built. There was no specific moment that marked that change. There was no clear decision that said he had been replaced. But through each match, each season, it became clearer. His playing time decreased, his role became more faded, and in the moments where before he would have been the one trusted absolutely, now he had to wait, had to prove himself again from the beginning, had to accept that his position was no longer guaranteed. The pain did not lie in no longer being the center, but in the fact that he still knew he could make a difference, still felt the moments where he could change the match, but was no longer given the full opportunity to do so. On the grass, he was still Roberto Baggio, still had those touches that made the audience stand up, still had those goals with his own mark that no one else could recreate, but those moments were no longer enough to keep him in his old position, because football not only changed in the way it was played, but also changed in the way it was evaluated, where stability, physical condition, and the ability to follow the system became more important than pure creativity. And in that new world, Roberto became a paradox, a player that everyone acknowledged was special, but no one really knew where to place him. Coaches came and went, each bringing a different philosophy, but the common point was that he never completely fit. There were matches where he was given the opportunity and shone, only to return to the bench in the next match, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he did not completely match the bigger picture the team was building. And in that repetition, a feeling gradually formed, not failure, but being faded out, slowly, without noise, but clear enough for him to realize that he was losing his place in the very world where he had once been the center. What made it all heavier was that he still continued to fight, not only with the system but with his own body. The pains did not disappear, the after-effects from the old injury still existed, and every time he stepped onto the field, he still had to carry everything he had carried for 20 years. But now those efforts were no longer viewed in the same way. no longer placed in the light of admiration, but sometimes only seen as the efforts of a player trying to hold on to what was left of his career. There were days he stepped onto the field and clearly felt that he was becoming part of the past, not because he had stopped, but because the world around him was moving forward without waiting for him anymore. And in that moment, the loneliness he had once felt in childhood, in the injury and the years of playing in silence, returned once again, but this time deeper, because it was not only the feeling of not being understood, but the feeling of gradually being forgotten while he was still there. But even in that fading, Roberto did not stop, did not leave, did not accept disappearing quietly. He continued to play, continued to look for moments where he could make a difference, continued to carry two parallel lives, one life that the world gradually forgot, and one life that he was still living, still enduring, still fighting, not to prove anything to others, but only to keep a part of himself in a world that was gradually no longer having space for him. When the football world gradually moved away from him, when the lights no longer shone in the familiar way, Roberto Baggio did not choose to fight against it with anger or desperate efforts to hold on, but quietly turned to another path, a path not on the grass, without spectators, without cheers, but which became the only place that helped him face everything he had carried throughout his life. That was when he turned to Buddhism, not as a trend or an escape, but as a way to understand more clearly the pain he had never spoken about. In the years when his career was no longer stable, when he was no longer placed in the central position, when questions about his own value began to appear, Buddhism brought him a different perspective, not about winning or losing, but about acceptance, about seeing things as they were, without adding, without subtracting, and that began to change the way he looked back at his life. What had once been seen as failure, like the shot in 1994, was no longer a wound that needed to be hidden or justified, but became a part of the journey, a part inseparable from who he was, and when he stopped trying to define himself by those moments, the burden he had carried for many years began to become lighter, not because it disappeared, but because he no longer resisted it. Before that, even though he did not say it, Roberto had always carried within him a need to prove that he was still worthy, that he was still the player the world had once praised, that he was not just a misunderstood moment, but over time that need gradually dissolved, not because he gave up, but because he realized that continuously trying to prove something to the world only bound him more to expectations he could not control. Instead, he began to look for peace in simpler things, in playing when he could, in accepting when he was not chosen, in understanding that his value did not only lie in how others saw him. The biggest change was not the circumstances around him, but the way he responded to them. Before, his silence had been a mechanism to endure, a way to keep what he could not say, but now that silence carried a different meaning, it became a choice, a space where he could exist without needing to explain, without needing to protect his image before the world. He no longer tried to fight what had happened, no longer tried to change the way others remembered him, but accepted that every story had many ways of being told, and not all of them were within his control. In that acceptance, Roberto began to live a different life, not the life of a player fighting to keep his position, but the life of a human learning to live with what could not be changed, the injuries that would never disappear, the memories that would never fade, the moments that the world would always remember in their own way, and instead of trying to erase them, he let them exist, as a part of himself, without needing to be fixed, without needing to be explained. Perhaps for many people, that was letting go, but for Roberto it was a different kind of strength, not the strength to win, but the strength not to be broken by what had happened. He did not return to the peak in the way the world expected, did not completely change the story that people had attached to him, but he found something else, a peace he had never had when he was the center of the lights. And in that peace, his second life was no longer a burden to be hidden, but became a part that he could accept, quietly, without anyone needing to understand, without anyone needing to see, only needing that he himself no longer had to run away from it. After all those years living between two worlds where light and pain always existed in parallel, Roberto Baggio finally found a space where he no longer needed to split himself, no longer needed to hide anything, no longer needed to endure in silence to keep a perfect image before the world. That was family life, a small discrete world almost completely separated from everything that had once defined him on the grass. There were no cheers, no lights, no expectant eyes or questions from the media, only simple moments that he had never truly experienced fully during his top-level playing time, where he was not a symbol, not a hero, not the one carrying the responsibility of an entire nation, but just a husband, a father, a normal human with emotions that did not need to be hidden. In that space, Roberto began to live a life where pain was no longer the center, not because it disappeared, because his body still carried all the traces of the past, the injuries, the prolonged pains, all still there, but for the first time they no longer defined the way he existed every day. His role changed, no longer measured by the number of goals, the number of matches or the titles, but by smaller things, things that no one recorded, no one broadcast, but which carried deeper meaning than any moment on the grass. As a husband, he was present in a way he had never had the chance before, not distracted by the match schedule, not pulled by external pressure, and as a father he found a different kind of responsibility, not the responsibility to win, but the responsibility to be there, to listen, to share, things that he himself had lacked in his early years. What was notable was that he did not try to turn this life into a story to tell the world, did not use his fame to maintain attention, did not appear frequently before the media to remind people of what he had once achieved, but on the contrary he actively stepped out of all of that, as if he understood that to keep this peace, he had to give up the need to be seen, to be mentioned, to be recognized. And in that withdrawal he did not lose anything, but on the contrary he gradually took back the parts of himself that had previously been swept away by his career, by pressure, by expectations that never stopped. There was no longer a division between two lives, no longer one version that had to shine before the public and one version that had to endure in silence behind. Roberto began to exist as a more whole human, not perfect, not without pain, but no longer having to hide it, no longer having to turn it into a secret. The memories of the grass, of the World Cup, of the moments that had shaped the way the world saw him were still there, but they no longer dominated the way he lived every day, no longer something he had to face continuously, but became a part of the past, a part that had been accepted. There was perhaps what made this life special was not that it was completely without pain, but that for the first time he did not have to live to overcome that pain, did not have to fight against it, did not have to prove that he was stronger than it, but simply to live with it, in a space where it was no longer the center of everything. And in that simplicity, in those unrecorded, unhonored moments, Roberto Baggio found something he had never had during 20 years of playing, a life that did not need to be divided in two, a life where he could be himself without needing to hide any part, a life that for the first time no longer hurt him. Even after finding a quiet space in his private life, when family became the only place that did not make him split himself, Roberto Baggio still had not completely left the grass, because football was not just a part of his life, but something that had shaped his entire being from the very first days, and therefore the final years of his career were not a journey to regain glory but a journey of existence, a journey where he continued not because his body allowed it, but because he was not yet ready to let go completely. But if there was one clear thing in this period, it was that he never really became better in the way the world usually understood. His body did not recover, did not return to its original state. No miracle happened to erase the damage that had accumulated over many years, but on the contrary, each passing season left new marks, new limits that he had to learn to adapt to. In this phase, everything slowed down. There were no longer powerful bursts of speed, no longer the flexibility of before. Every run was calculated, every movement had to be considered, not to optimize playing efficiency, but to ensure that the body could continue to endure. And it was precisely in that change that the way he played the ball also changed, no longer relying much on speed or strength but on experience, on reading the game, on the ability to see spaces that others did not see. And although those qualities were still enough to make a difference, it was clear that it no longer brought the same dominance as before. He no longer looked for brilliant comebacks, no longer tried to prove that he could still be the center of every gaze, but instead accepted his role in the new context, accepted that time had passed, that his body no longer allowed him to do everything he once did, and what mattered was no longer how much he could achieve, but how long he could continue. There were matches where he came on and still created moments that reminded people of who he once was, subtle touches, passes full of feeling, shots that still carried his own mark, but those moments no longer happened frequently but became short flashes of light in a changed reality. What was notable was that he never tried to hide that reality, never tried to create an illusion that everything was still the same, but accepted it quietly, in the way he had accepted everything that had come before, from the injury, from failure, from the world's misunderstanding. He did not fight to return to the peak, but simply continued to step onto the field when he could, continued to play when his body allowed, continued to exist in a space he had dedicated most of his life to, not to prove anything but because that was the only way he knew not to abandon himself. In the final years, there was a subtle but profound change. He was no longer defined by whether he played well or not, no longer let the result of each match affect the way he saw himself, but began to find value in the very fact that he was still there, still present, still able to step onto the field even if only for a short time, and in a world where everything was usually measured by achievements, by titles, by standout moments, the way he existed became something different, something not easy to see, but carrying a deeper meaning. It may not have been an ideal ending for many people, not the glorious conclusion that a great player deserved, but for Roberto, it was a different kind of completeness, not perfect, not whole in the usual way, but authentic, because it exactly reflected who he was, a person who had never escaped pain, had never had the chance to start over, but still continued, not because everything became easier, but because he had never chosen to stop. And in that continuation, in stepping forward even when no longer intact, Roberto Baggio did not become a story of miraculous recovery, but became a story of resilience, of the ability to exist under imperfect conditions, of continuing to live and continuing to walk, even when knowing he would never be as before. And perhaps that was what truly defined the person he was, more than any title, more than any moment the world had ever remembered. When everything had passed, when the stadiums gradually became memories, when the cheers only echoed in old footage, Roberto Baggio's life did not end like a simple story of victory or defeat, but appeared as a complex journey lasting more than 2 decades, where two lives always existed in parallel, never truly separated, never truly becoming one. If looking back from the early days in Caldogno, from a quiet boy growing up in a large family where emotions were not spoken, where silence became a natural part of existence, to the peak years when he became a symbol of Italian football, and then the years after when he was gradually pushed out of the center of the lights, there was one thing running through it all, that was the way he lived with two different realities, one reality that the world saw, and one reality that only he had to carry. On one side was the life of glory, of goals, of moments that made millions stand up, of the Ballon d'Or in 1993, of the matches at the World Cup where he became the greatest hope of an entire nation, of the big clubs he once wore the jersey for, where his name was mentioned with respect, where he was called a genius, an artist, one of the greatest number 10s that football had ever had. That was the life the world recorded, replayed, honored, a life full of light, full of emotion, and full of moments that people could easily understand and remember. But on the other side there always existed another life, silent and untold, a life that began from the injury at 18 years old, when his body was never the same again, when every run carried a limitation that no one saw, when every match was a trade-off between ability and pain. That was the life of nights without sleep because the body would not allow rest, of mornings where standing up became a challenge, of injections before matches that no one mentioned, of moments in the locker room where he had to stay longer than everyone else just to regain the feeling that he could walk. That was the life with no audience, no lights, no recognition of any kind, but which took up most of his time and energy. Those two lives did not exist separately, but always overlapped in every moment. When he scored a beautiful goal, it was not only the result of talent, but also the result of him having overcome pain to be able to stand there. When he missed the penalty at the 1994 FIFA World Cup, it was not just a mistake, but the end point of a body that had been pushed to its final limit, but the world only saw half of the story, and because of that they never truly understood the whole person he was. What was special was not that he had lived two lives, but the way he had never spoken about it. Throughout his career he did not stand up to tell his story, did not use pain as a reason, did not turn difficulties into part of his public image, but kept everything inside, in the way he had done since he was a child, as if he believed that there were things that did not need to be explained in order to exist. That silence was not weakness but a different kind of strength, a strength that did not need to be proven, did not need to be recognized, but was enough to help him continue walking under conditions where many others might have stopped. From the outside people might remember him through the titles, through specific moments, through a shot that went off target. But if looking deeper, Roberto Baggio's real legacy did not lie in what he had won, but in the way he had existed, the way he had continued to play in an imperfect body, the way he had accepted what could not be changed without letting it break him. He never escaped pain, never had a period where everything became easier, never was given a perfect story, but he also never stopped. And perhaps what made his story different was not that he had risen from hardship, but that he had learned to live with it, without trying to erase it, without trying to turn it into something else, but accepting it as a part of himself. In a world where people often looked for clear victory stories, where every journey was simplified into success or failure, Roberto Baggio's life existed as something more complex, something that could not be summarized in a single moment, a title, or a single memory. He was not a perfect hero, not a fairy tale with a complete ending, but a real human, with cracks, with limits, with pains that never disappeared, but it was precisely in that imperfection that he created a legacy that not everyone could achieve, a legacy that did not lie in how many times he had won, but in how many times he had continued, when everything inside him said he should stop. And when looking back at that entire journey, what remained was not a shot, not a title, but the image of a human who had walked through 20 years of life with two parallel realities, one reality that the world saw, and one reality that only he understood. And in that prolonged silence, Roberto Baggio not only became a legend of football, but also became proof of something simple yet rare, that sometimes the greatest strength of a human does not lie in their ability to win, but in their ability to keep walking even when they have never truly escaped the pain. The story of Roberto Baggio not only leaves admiration but also evokes a deep sadness when we look back at the entire journey he went through, a journey where glory always walked parallel with pain. From the image of the fateful shot at the 1994 FIFA World Cup, where the whole world only saw a failure, to the little-known details like him playing with a prolonged damaged knee, having to use painkillers to take the field, or the lonely recovery sessions after each match, all have shown a heartbreaking truth. Sometimes the most honored people are the ones who have to endure the most in silence. What makes this story haunting is not only the physical pain, but also the way he chose not to explain, not to resist the criticism in Part 10, or the way he accepted being forgotten in Part 11 without trying to hold on to his image. That very silence, combined with turning to Buddhism in Part 12, shows a rare inner strength, a strength that is not loud but enduring. For the people of the United States, where success is often measured by results and public recognition, this story brings an important lesson. The value of a human does not only lie in what they achieve, but also in the way they face failure, pain, and what cannot be changed. Baggio did not win in the usual way, but he did something harder, continued to live, continued to walk, even when no one understood his whole story. If the story of Roberto Baggio makes you feel the value of silent endurance, please hit subscribe to the channel and leave a heart. That is how we together honor those who kept walking even while carrying pain. Thank you for listening until the end, and see you in the next video, where untold stories are still waiting to be told.